Hello and welcome to Supposedly Fun. My name is Greg. I am here today because something very exciting has happened. We have gotten the shortlist for the Booker Prize 2025, and in an unprecedented turn of events, I have read 3 of the books that are on the shortlist, and I just started a 4th. To be fair, it's unprecedented because I don't typically read my way through a long list. For whatever reason, I really just started doing it this year. So look at that. I've already read half of the short list. I will say part of me had just been hoping, based on my experience reading through the short list, that I had been kind of hoping that the books I had read would not be on the short list and that there would be... But anyway, we'll talk about the books that were shortlisted just momentarily. The first thing I really want to talk about is a surprise. We're going to talk about other surprises. But the first one, what happened to Endling? What happened? I was feeling more and more secure in the thought that Endling was going to be on the shortlist. I have been getting a lot of really great feedback. One thing that has been very consistent in the comments on reviews or Friday Reads videos that I have done recently, as I have been reading my way through some of the long list, is people just saying, I really hope you read Endling because it's so good. And a lot of people have been saying, I hope it wins. And now it's not on the shortlist. That feels surprising. I didn't do official predictions, but had I done official predictions, I would have said the 2 sure bets are Audition by Katie Kitamura and Endling by Maria Reva. And then one of those turned out not to be true. I really thought there was a case to be made for this, but I guess not. So we'll talk more about the long-listed books a little bit later, but I just wanted to mention that at the top because, as I said, I've been getting so much good feedback about Endling that it feels shocking that it is not on the short list. That's the big surprise, I guess. Let's run through the books on the shortlist very quickly. Then I will do some facts about the shortlist provided by the Booker website, which will be also linked down below. And down below, there will be links to all of these books. I would still warn you, some of these books have not been released in the United States. Some of them, like The Rest of Our Lives by Ben Markowitz, has announced a date. It won't be out until January, but it is coming. And Sea Scraper won't be out until November. Land in Winter, but I'll have links to all of the books on bookshop.org. If you want more information about the books, you can follow those links. If you want to purchase, you can follow those links and all of that good stuff. I'll have the reviews to the 4 books that I have read so far down below, and just lots of fun stuff in the description box. So the books that made it onto the shortlist: Flesh by David Zaloy, The Land in Winter by Andrew Miller, The Rest of Our Lives by Ben Markowitz, Audition by Katie Kitamura, The Loneliness of Sonia and Sunny, and Flashlight by Susan Choi. We'll talk more about the long list in just a moment. First, let's take a break and read what the jury has said about this shortlist. Featuring both classical storytelling and novels that push the boundaries of narrative form, the shortlist explores the ties that bind families together and the moments of crisis that can pull them apart. The characters navigate familiar domestic situations, the power dynamic shifts between parents and their children, marriages come adrift, families reckon with the weight of their own history, and individuals perform the roles others expect them to play. Together, the shortlisted books transport readers from Hungary to Japan, from Italy to the US, from India to England, and feature often rootless characters far from the places they once called home. The books take place over vastly differing time spans, some over the course of just a few days or weeks, others over several decades. The judges' selection features writers deep into their literary careers. 5 out of the 6 have more than 5 books to their name, 2 with more than 10, and 1 whose third was 20 years in the making. That one is The Loneliness of Sonia and Sunny, by the way. It also has authors representing 4 nationalities across 3 continents. It has previous Booker Prize winner Kiran Desai, past shortlistees Andrew Miller and David Zaloy, and 3 authors who make their Booker Prize shortlist debut. It has novels that range in length from one under 200 pages, taking place over a few months, to an almost 700-page love story spanning years. That 700-page one is The Loneliness of Sonia and Sunny, and I'm willing to bet that the one under 200 pages, it's Audition. It's just under 200 pages, but it is that one. And it features authors who are in total command of their own store of English, their own rhythm, their own expertise to create books that are brilliantly written and brilliantly human, according to Roddy Doyle, the chair of the 2025 judges. So Roddy Doyle is joined, by the way, by Ayabami Adebayo, Sarah Jessica Parker, Chris Power, and Kylie Reed. Now, let's start talking about the books that made it onto the shortlist. The first one is one of the ones that I've already read. It's Flesh by David Zaloy. Now, this is the most recent one that I read, and of the 4 that I have read, it's the one that I ranked in first. However, when I said that in my review, which will be again linked down below, I said it's one of those situations where, when you're watching the Great British Baking Show and they are ranking the bakers as they have performed in the technical, but sometimes they'll announce who's first, and Paul Hollywood will be like, don't clap because this was still not good. That's kind of how I feel about Flesh. Like, yes, it came in first in my ranking, but I didn't really enjoy it all that much. And I go into a lot of what I wasn't responding to and what it meant and what was interesting enough about it that it was the best of the bunch that I had read. So I won't take up a whole lot of time here, but to me, it does sort of fall into some of the traps that the books that I had read fall into, which is that they are much more vibe books than they are plot books. And I didn't think of myself as a particularly plot-centric reader, but in at least these 4 books, I found myself just without anything to grasp onto and sort of struggling because it feels like so much is left up to you, the reader, that I felt frustrated because even when people talk about like Flesh as being a story about, David Zaloy being a writer who is very in tune with a sort of modern masculinity and all that, you can sort of see that in Flesh, but you have to bring that idea to the book. It doesn't actually give you a whole lot. So that was a little frustrating for me. So before we move on, I will read the quick summary of it that they have on their website. A propulsive, hypnotic novel about a man who is unraveled by a series of events beyond his grasp. 15-year-old Istvan lives with his mother in a quiet apartment complex in Hungary. New to the town and shy, he is unfamiliar with the social rituals at school and soon becomes isolated, with his neighbor, a married woman close to his mother's age, as his only companion. Their encounters shift into a clandestine relationship that Istvan barely understands, and his life soon spirals out of control. As the years pass, he is carried gradually upwards on the 21st century's tides of money and power, moving from the army to the company of London's super-rich, with his own competing impulses for love, intimacy, status, and wealth, winning him unimaginable riches until they threaten to undo him completely. Spare and penetrating, Flesh asks profound questions about what drives life, what makes it worth living, and what breaks it. And those are all interesting questions. And when you distill the plot down, it does sound like a lot happens. But when you're reading the book, you just sort of have the sense of almost aimlessly floating along. And Istvan is interesting. I think that's one of the things that worked about Flesh for me. But, even those questions about what drives a life, I feel like Istvan is someone who doesn't have a whole lot of drive as presented in the book. So that question sort of stalls out right there. But that's my opinion. I know other people have really loved this book. That's just what I took away from it. I feel like you can point toward these questions, but for me, the actual experience of reading it was a little bit hollow. So that's my experience of it. And yours may be different. And that's great. All right, the next one is another one that I had read, The Land in Winter by Andrew Miller. And this is the one that I had ranked second among the 4 books. But again, it comes with that caveat that okay, well, these are the top of the pack, but I still didn't really enjoy them all that much. And it comes down to a lot of the same thing. Like, this is a book that's about vibes. Not much actually happens, which is kind of funny to say because, again, I feel like when you read the description of the book, it sounds like a lot happens, but when you read the book, it feels like a lot of time is passing and not much is happening. And it's interesting. It is the portrait of 4 people and 2 marriages. They are neighbors and they are living through a blizzard in 1962, or like a real thing that happened. And this blizzard, you could say, sort of tests their lives. It actually is the book that I was thinking of when I was reading how they described the shortlist on the website, specifically novels that push the boundaries of narrative form. The shortlist explores the ties that bind families together in the moments of crisis that can pull them apart. You could sort of apply that pull them apart to The Land in Winter. And then you have the characters navigate familiar domestic situations. The power dynamic shifts between parents and their children. Marriages come adrift. Families reckon with the weight of their own history, and individuals perform the roles others expect them to play. Like beat by beat, they could be describing The Land in Winter. Every single item on that list points to The Land in Winter by Andrew Miller. There are ways in which you can point to aspects of that list in other books. Like I could point to some of it in Flesh, certainly, since we've already talked about that book. But this it really just feels like they're talking about The Land in Winter very specifically with that. But I almost DNF'd The Land in Winter because as I approached the halfway point, I just felt stuck. It felt like things weren't really happening. And it's not that I was not enjoying the book so much as I didn't feel inspired to pick it up anymore. And that's not a great thing. So I took a break over a weekend, read something else short for Shorty September, and that allowed me to get back to The Land in Winter and sort of power through it to the end. But I was like this close to putting it down and not picking it back up. And I did have a similar thing in the middle of Flesh by David Saloy, where I took a break from it for a weekend, but I was not as close to DNFing that book as I was The Land in Winter, being honest. Here is what they say about this book. Now, I will say before we get into this, Andrew Miller is an incredible writer. The writing in this book is absolutely beautiful. The way he describes things, the way he creates the characters that feel like people in many ways. You can tell he knows what he's doing. Having beaten the book down a little bit, I will build it back up a bit by saying that. Here's what they say about it. A masterful, page-turning examination of the minutiae of life and a dazzling chronicle of the human heart. December 1962, the West Country. Local doctor Eric Parry, mulling secrets, sets out on his rounds while his pregnant wife sleeps on in the warmth of their cottage. Across the field, funny, troubled Rita Simmons is also asleep, her head full of images of a past life her husband prefers to ignore. He's been up for hours, tending to the needs of the small dairy farm where he hoped to create a new version of himself, a project that's already faltering. But when the ordinary cold of an English December gives way to violent blizzards, the two couples find their lives beginning to unravel. Where do you hide when you can't leave home? And where, in a frozen world, can you turn to? And that is an apt description, but the experience of reading the book, again, just starts to feel like not much is happening as you pivot chapter by chapter among the characters, and even there are stretches where you don't check in with certain characters. So it's just, you sort of lose touch with them. And the structure of that is interesting. The way Andrew Miller has set it up so that you almost lose touch with somebody before they come back into the story. It's interesting, but it also approaches feeling stultifying in that way that not much is happening. And I felt frustrated by it by the time I got to the end. Again, being honest. So that was my experience of it. I know there are people out there who have loved both of these books. Clearly the jury liked these books so far. So, it is what it is. Now we get to the first one that I have not read. And I admit, I am really astonished to see The Rest of Our Lives by Ben Markovits on the shortlist, because the feedback I've seen on this book has been pretty universally negative. Even people who see good qualities in it are kind of like, it was just fine. And yet here it is on the shortlist, and Endling is not. It's just interesting. I haven't read either one of those books, but I have one that I have gotten very good feedback about and people are excited about. And The Rest of Our Lives, which did make the shortlist, but people have basically been like, nah. So it's just interesting. And I had been talking about how when I was running through the books that were remaining from the long list, if there were any that I still wanted to read, and I mentioned I felt pretty comfortable passing over The Rest of Our Lives completely based on the feedback that I had gotten from other people. But it's here. Here's what they say about it. An unforgettable road trip of a novel about getting older and the challenges of long-term marriage. What's left when your kids grow up and leave home? When Tom Layward's wife had an affair, he resolved to leave her as soon as his youngest daughter turned 18. 12 years later, while driving her to Pittsburgh to start university, he remembers his pact. He is also on the run from his own health issues, and the fact that he's been put on leave at work after students complained about the politics of his law class, something he hasn't yet told his wife. So, after dropping Miriam off, he keeps driving, with the vague plan of visiting various people from his past, an old college friend, his ex-girlfriend, his brother, his son, en route, maybe, to his father's grave in California. Pitch perfect, quietly exhilarating, and moving, The Rest of Our Lives is a novel about family, marriage, and those moments which may come to define us. Which sounds interesting. It sounds like a very Greg book. You know, I love a book about a complicated family, but it kind of touches on things that annoy me. Like, I feel like I've read so many books about a man who is having work trouble that he has not communicated to his wife, marriage trouble, and just feels lost at this point in his life, that I also have a bit of a resistance to that storyline at this point, because if you're going to tell that story, there's got to be something interesting about it. Clearly, the jury feels that there is something interesting about this version of that story, but from what I've heard from people who have read it, it doesn't quite live up to that. So I don't feel that I will be picking this book up. And that's not an attempt to judge it or review it. It's just from what I've heard and from my reaction to the plot description, it doesn't really sound like something that I'll be shocked if it wins. And it doesn't sound like something that I want to take the time out of my, there are other things that I would like to be getting to. So I feel pretty confident leaving it alone. Then, a book I am absolutely not surprised to see on the shortlist, because as I said, if I had done a solid prediction of what would be on the shortlist, I would have said Endling, and I would have said Audition by Katie Kitamura. It's going to be really interesting to see what happens with this book. Part of me feels like this is going to run away with it, but there are other contenders. Obviously there are 5 other contenders, but I feel like there are other books that are building a strong momentum for the big prize at the end. By the way, the winner, I believe, is going to be announced on October 7th. Let me double check that. Oh, God, I said October 7th. October 7th is when we get the shortlist for the National Book Award. November 10th is when we get the winner of the Booker Prize. So stay tuned for that. But yeah, Audition by Katie Kitamura. This is one of the ones that I read. I ranked it 3rd. And part of me does wonder, maybe I was a little cruel to this book, but it is a book that really frustrated me. I mentioned I had been getting frustrated, or had grown frustrated with The Land in Winter by the end, and in the middle, I just didn't feel interested in picking it up. Well, if Audition hadn't been as short as it is, I would have given it up, for sure. If it wasn't for the Booker Prize Longlist, if it wasn't for the fact that it's short, I would have DNF'd this book, because I was much more frustrated with Audition than I was with The Land in Winter. And that's why it was 3rd in my ranking of the 4 books that I have read so far. And obviously, there are a lot of other people who have enjoyed this more. I think it's going to come down to your personal taste as a reader. I felt very frustrated because this is a book that reads like an essay at times, presenting themes, but not really making a statement about them. It's sort of presenting a case to make you think about things. And I find that it's not what I pick up a book for. When I pick up a book, I enjoy, like The Land in Winter or Flesh, I enjoy getting in the head of somebody who is not like me, from a time that I did not live through, or a situation that I did not live through, like a blizzard in 1962 England. And I enjoy getting to know them and what their lives are like. And Audition is a thought exercise, and I don't really enjoy that. So I had a visceral knee-jerk reaction to this book because it does something that annoys me in fiction, and it's hard to get around that. Other people obviously don't have the same thing. And that's fine. That's great. That's one of the things that makes it interesting. And I'm glad that so many people have liked Audition more than I did. But it's also a hard book to talk about because you can't really get far into what this thought exercise is without, spoiling the book for people who might want to read it. Here's what their description of it is. An exhilarating, destabilizing novel that asks whether we ever really know the people we love. Two people meet for lunch in a Manhattan restaurant. She's an accomplished actress in rehearsals for an upcoming premiere. He's attractive, troubling, young enough to be her son. Who is he to her, and who is she to him? In this compulsively readable, brilliantly constructed novel, two competing narratives unspool, rewriting our understanding of the roles we play every day: partner, parent, creator, muse, and the truths every performance masks, especially from those who think they know us most intimately. And it's hard to get into more specifics than that, but I will not be surprised if Audition ends up winning on November 10th, but for me personally, it was a frustrating reading experience. It's not what I pick up a book hoping to experience, and that's a hard thing to get around. I would say knee-jerk reaction, the biggest competition for Audition is probably The Loneliness of Sonia and Sunny by Kiran Desai. And again, Kiran Desai had won a Booker Prize for The Inheritance of Loss, so she's back. This is the one that I have just started. Because it is such a long book, I'm not far into it at all. I think I've listened to an hour and I'm like 5% into the book at this point. But it is incredibly well written. I'm already feeling very compelled to keep listening to the story. It'll be interesting to see if the book sustains that over... It's a 25-hour audiobook, and like I said, I'm an hour into it. So when you have a long book like that, there is a challenge of sustaining the story for that long. And it'll be interesting to see how it does. Right now, I'm feeling into it, but we'll see what happens 24 hours of audio from now. Here's how they describe the book. A spellbinding story of two young people whose fates intersect and diverge across continents and years. An epic of love and family, India and America, tradition and modernity. When Sonia and Sunny first glimpse each other on an overnight train, they are immediately captivated, yet also embarrassed by the fact that their grandparents had once tried to matchmake them, a clumsy meddling that only served to drive Sonia and Sunny apart. Sonia, an aspiring novelist who recently completed her studies in the snowy mountains of Vermont, has returned to her family in India, fearing that she is haunted by a dark spell cast by an artist to whom she had once turned for intimacy and inspiration. Sunny, a struggling journalist resettled in New York City, is attempting to flee his imperious mother and the violence of his warring clan. Uncertain of their future, Sonia and Sunny embark on a search for happiness together as they confront the many alienations of our modern world. The Loneliness of Sonia and Sunny is the sweeping tale of two young people navigating the many forces that shape their lives: country, class, race, history, and the complicated bonds that link one generation to the next. A love story, a family saga, and a rich novel of ideas, it is the most ambitious and accomplished work yet by one of our greatest novelists. And, being only an hour into a 25-hour audiobook, I feel like I can't really add much to that. I just feel like this book has a lot of momentum. The tricky part is that it's released today, the day that I'm filming this. So the same day that it made the shortlist, it has only just been published. So anyone who has read this book so far was able to get early access to it, which means that the majority of people following the Booker Prize have not read this yet. So there's still a lot of feedback to get. I think a lot of the anticipation has been just that, anticipation of something you keep hearing good things about. And now it's released and the majority can sort of offer a consensus on the book. So far, it looks positive, but it will be interesting to see what happens as now that the book has been released, if the dynamic or the conversation around it starts to change. But it feels like a very heavy contender, and I would say maybe the spoiler would be Audition by Katie Kitamura. But there's still Flashlight by Susan Choi, which was also longlisted for the National Book Award for fiction, and I'll have my reaction to that linked down below. Susan Choi has won the National Book Award for fiction for Trust Exercise. Although I am not as sold on the concept of this book as something that I want to read. I am glad to have this advanced reader's copy of it from FSG. And I think I will end up reading it. I'm just not in a hurry to do it. But it feels like this is a pretty solid contender for the Booker Prize, and it feels like a pretty solid contender for the National Book Award. Now, someday there will be a book that wins the Booker Prize and the National Book Award. And even though I haven't read this yet, even though I am not entirely convinced that it's something that I'm going to enjoy, I will try it. But it does feel like a book that could win both. And I'm always going to be excited for that. You know, I want a world where that is possible for a book to win 2 major literary prizes like that. And, you know, next year, it could end up winning the Pulitzer. It could end up winning the Women's Prize. I love the idea of a book pulling off 2 major literary prizes. I love the idea of a book pulling off a hat trick and getting 3. Susan Choi is a woman, so she could get all 4. I don't think that would ever happen, but I love the idea that somebody could run the gauntlet and get all of those. So it has me a little bit excited for a book that I haven't read and I'm not convinced that I would like. But there's something appealing to me about that idea. Here's how they describe this book. A thrilling, globe-spanning novel that mines questions of memory, language, identity, and family. One evening, 10-year-old Louisa and her father take a walk out on the breakwater. They are spending the summer in a coastal Japanese town while her father, Cirque, a Korean emigre, completes an academic secondment from his American university. When Louisa wakes hours later, she has washed up on the beach and her father is missing, probably drowned. The disappearance of Louisa's father shatters their small family unit. As Louisa and her American mother, Anne, return to the U.S., this traumatic event reverberates across time and space, and the mystery of what really happened to Cirque slowly unravels. Flashlight moves between the post-war Korean immigrant community in Japan to suburban America and the North Korean regime to tell the astonishing story of one family swept up in the tides of 20th century history. Now, that sounds like a me book. And I was really interested in it when I first heard about it. I mean, you know, the idea of a traumatic event reverberating across time and space, that's a very me topic. What has challenged that is that as people have started reading the Longlist, I've gotten a lot of comments that the book is too long, that it could have been edited, and there are parts of it that sag. And it's about a 450-page book. And also, I've gotten some complaints that the story itself is interesting, but too tricky. So those have given me pause. I do think, because there is a National Book Award connection to this book, that I am probably going to end up reading it. And because there's a Pulitzer connection, possibly, in the future. And if you know me, you know I'm obsessed with the Pulitzer Prize for fiction. But yeah, so I will end up reading this one. I don't know when. Maybe later maybe at some point in October. That's the idea, but we'll sort of see how things go. I feel like I'm having read 4 of the Booker Longlist titles and 3 of the Shortlist titles, and already working on a 4th shortlisted title. I don't feel like I'm in a rush to get to any others. Like I said, there are other things that I'd like to get to. So we'll see. But Flashlight is one that I would like to read, ideally before the prize is announced. But it is what it is. Speaking of the rest of the books, again, I just feel really surprised that Endling is not here. And it's one that I haven't read, but I want to. I had been planning to, in my mind, that this might be a good October book for me. And I think I might still try to do that. Again, I'm a mood reader, so it's a little difficult for me to predict what I'm going to read when. But I would still like to read this book. And given the enormous positive feedback I've gotten on it, it is sad to have to say goodbye to it on this Booker journey. And we'll see what happens. At the end of the day, I do think that we can be happy that the Longlist did put this book on a lot of people's radars, because I don't think a lot of people had heard about this book before the Longlist. So we can all be thankful for that it sort of entered the conversation. And especially, I know people don't like when you bring politics into a conversation about book prizes, but given the fact that this is a novel set in Ukraine and that the war in Ukraine enters into the plot so significantly. It also kind of felt that this is a book that stands on its own merits based on the feedback that I've heard from other people, but that political relevance would also sort of propel it onto the shortlist. Maybe not to the win, but at least onto the shortlist. So again, it just feels very surprising that it didn't make it onto the shortlist. I'm not surprised Misinterpretation didn't make it. That one seemed very cilantro. People either loved it or they hated it, and more people tended to lean toward the hated it camp. So I'm not surprised that one did not make it onto the shortlist. Sea Scraper, I am a bit surprised because that book definitely has its fans. And although I had decided that I wasn't going to try to read it before it is released in the United States, I may still look for it when it is. And I am sort of surprised that it didn't make it onto the list. Then there is One Boat. Not surprised that one didn't make it because most of the feedback I got was kind of like, it's fine. And honestly, the same kind of goes with Universality. I'm not entirely surprised that that one did not make it. I'm kind of glad The South by Tash didn't make it onto the shortlist. That is the first book that I read. I was so excited about it based on the description of it. I got a copy of it and I read it and I just felt like it was a nothing book. It's well written, but I got nothing out of it. Nothing happens. It doesn't say anything. That's kind of how I felt about it. So, and I did talk to some people in comments who felt the same way about it. The most interesting thing you can talk about when it comes to the South is that idea that the time it is set in, a financial collapse in Malaysia, and but it points toward a lot of issues without actually saying anything about them. And it is the first in a planned, I think it's a series of 4 books. And it feels like it's doing a lot of setup work and then the rest will come later. And it's just a book of setup, and I didn't enjoy that. Love Forms by Claire Adam is another book I've heard a lot of really great things about. And I can see, I feel like I can actually see where Sea Scraper didn't make it onto the shortlist, just like I can kind of see where Love Forms didn't as well. But I've heard a lot of really good things about Love Forms, and it is still one that I would like to read. I do have a hold on it at my library if that ever becomes available, because I've been on hold since the Longlist was announced. I would like to read it. So I can see where it didn't make it onto the shortlist, but I have heard a lot of good things about it, and I would actually still like to read it. So that's where we stand with the Booker Prize. I'd love to hear your thoughts about the shortlist. Are you as surprised as I am that Endling didn't make it onto the shortlist? Is there something you would make a case for? Say that it should have been on the shortlist? What would it have replaced? All of that stuff. And what do you think is going to win? That's the big question. Let me know all of that stuff in the comment section down below. As always, I really appreciate your time. I'll see you November 10th, and I'll see you October 7th for the National Book Award shortlist. That's going to be really exciting and coming. And then October 9th, we get the Nobel Prize for Literature. Lots of exciting things coming. As always, I really appreciate your time. I will be back. Until next time, happy reading.